She was sold for being infertile. No explanations, no tears. Just a slip of paper signed with ink still wet, and the back of a hand brushing off the dust she left behind. The man who once called her wife didn't even look as they loaded her into the cart bound for somewhere between nowhere and shame. Her wrists were faint bruises from nights where silence had failed to shield her. She didn't scream. She just watched the sky, wide and bruised like her spirit, and counted the hawks overhead. The wagon bumped and jolted over dry roots and cracked earth. She sat between two crates of flour, the air thick with the scent of sun-scorched wood and horse sweat. No one spoke. The driver chewed tobacco and hummed something broken. And when dusk fell, they stopped under a dying cottonwood tree. He untied her hands, not kindly, but with a grunt, and tossed her a tin cup of water. "Rest," he said, not looking her way. "You'll be someone else's problem come sunrise." That night, sleep wouldn't come. Coyotes yipped in the distance. The stars above blinked cold and unfeeling, too far from mercy. She pressed her back against the wheel of the cart and pulled her shawl tight around her. It had belonged to her mother, now faded to the color of ash. She closed her eyes and tried to remember the warmth of hands that once braided her hair, the lull of soft voices before the world learned to measure a woman by what her body could give. Morning came red and mean. They rode into a small outpost. Town with one crooked church, two saloons, and a boarding house whose windows gaped like missing teeth. She was handed off with less ceremony than a parcel. A woman with sharp eyes and an apron stiff from wear inspected her like one might a mule. "She can scrub," said the man, pocketing the coin. The woman nodded. "She don't speak much. Not unless she's asked to." The door shut behind her, and the man rode off. Dust hung in the air like a held breath. Inside, the house smelled of boiled linens and old sorrow. The other girls, quiet, thin, with eyes too large for their faces, glanced at her, then looked away. She wasn't the first. She wouldn't be the last. Her room was a cot in the attic. One cracked window, one basin. The wind cried through the gaps in the walls. That night, she dreamed of rivers, wide and clean, and a voice she'd never heard calling her by a name she couldn't recall. She woke up with tears on her face, and her fingers clenched tight around her shawl. Somewhere, beyond the hills that fenced her in, a Lakota man had watched a crow fly low across the plain. His horse had stilled, ears twitching, as if listening for something more than wind. He didn't know yet whose sorrow he'd felt on the breeze, but soon he would. She did not speak unless spoken to. Even then, her words came soft, shaped more by breath and voice. The women in the boarding house stopped asking questions after the second week. There was something in her stillness that unnerved them, something hollow and deep, like the well behind the kitchen no one liked to draw from after dark. She scrubbed floors until her knees ached and her fingers cracked. She stitched torn sheets, poured tea, polished brass handles that no one noticed. The mistress of the house nodded her approval, but never once asked her name. Names were for women who stayed, not for shadows with silent eyes dot in town. They called her the one with no womb. Whispers followed her like dust. It didn't matter that she had never told anyone, not with words. The truth lived in her posture, in the way she flinched at children's laughter, how her gaze turned elsewhere when women spoke of suns and summers past. In the West, a woman without promise of blood was a ghost waiting to be forgotten. She bore it all with the quiet strength of dry grass, bent but not broken. The kind of woman storms passed over, but never uprooted. Her beauty was quiet. The kind that made men look twice, not because she wanted them to, but because something about her refusal to be noticed drew them like moths. High cheekbones, a long neck, eyes the color of dusk before rain, she carried herself like someone who had already died once and learned that life after death was mostly chores and silence. One night, while sweeping the front step, she saw a child drop a biscuit in the street. A stray dog snatched it up. The boy began to cry. She picked up the empty tin the biscuit had come from and held it out, offering what little bread she had from her apron. The boy stopped crying, took it, ran. She sat back on the step, broom across her knees, and for the first time in weeks, let herself smile. Just barely, that same evening, the Lakota man crossed into town. He didn't ride fast. His horse walked with the ease of one who had traveled many miles with no destination. He wore no feathers, no beads, no trappings of ceremony, only a worn leather coat and a braid tied with a single red thread. The townsfolk watched him from behind their curtains, measuring his presence like a change in the weather. He stopped in front of the boarding house, looked up. She was at the window, watching. Their eyes met only for a moment, but it was enough to carve a pause in the rhythm of her heart, enough to make her drop the cloth she had been wringing in her hands. He said nothing, just nodded once, as if to a memory he hadn't realized he'd lost. Then he moved on. She turned from the window, pressed her palm to her chest, unsure whether she was trembling from fear or from something she hadn't felt in years. Recognition. In the hours that followed, she scrubbed the same patch of floor 3 times, burned the stew, forgot to bolt the back door. The other women whispered, but she didn't hear them. That night, sleep came late, and when it did, her dreams were filled with a red braid, a deep voice, and a name she still couldn't remember, but now longed to. He returned 3 days later. No one expected him. The town was too small for visitors without purpose, too weary for men who didn't announce their reasons. But there he was again, reins in hand, coat dusted in wind. He dismounted outside the blacksmith's shop and tied his horse loosely, as if it might choose to leave if it pleased. Then he walked, slow, as if every step listened to the ground beneath it. She saw him from the laundry line. The sun behind him carved his shape into the earth like a story waiting to be told. She froze, wet sheet between her hands, the wind lifting it gently against her cheek. Their eyes met again, this time longer. No words passed, but her breath caught. He didn't stop at the house, just nodded again. A quiet gesture, like respect or memory. Inside, she moved without thought, folded linen after linen. Her hands trembled only once, when she held a piece of cloth the exact shade of his coat. By evening, word spread he was staying in the shed behind the church. Not with the preacher. He wasn't one for words, and certainly not scripture. But he'd offered to fix the roof, said nothing about pay, just looked up, then at his hands, and said it would fall soon if someone didn't see to it. He slept beside his horse the first night, rolled in a wool blanket, watched the stars like old friends, and whispered names they no longer answered to. He hadn't spoken Lakota in months, not since his brother passed, not since the snows buried what was left of home. They had taken his land, called it unclaimed, as if sweat and blood didn't count, as if the graves weren't there to argue. So he rode west, not to forget, just to stop remembering. He watched the town with quiet eyes, noticing what others missed, the way men avoided her, but lingered too long when she bent over her work, the way she walked around children, not from fear but sorrow, the way she never looked at the church, even in rain. He didn't ask. He didn't have to. Some wounds speak louder in silence, She brought him bread one morning, left it near the fence post while he worked on the shingles. He turned, saw her shadow retreating, and touched the loaf with reverence as if it had come from the earth itself. Next day, he left a carved bird at the back step. Small, simple, no paint, just wood shaped by someone who knew the patience of loss. She didn't cry. Not then, but that night. She held it to her chest, and her breathing shook like dry leaves in wind. They didn't speak, not really. Not yet. But the language of offerings had already begun. Bread for a bird. Silence for silence, and still something deeper stirred. Not desire. Not yet. But recognition. Like two ghosts brushing shoulders in the same empty room. He watched the way her hands moved, how her face held stillness like a pond holds the moon. She watched how he carried pain in the way he tied rope, the way he never sat with his back to an open door. Neither of them smiled much, but something unspoken had already taken root. He began to appear more often. Not like a visitor, not like someone passing through, but like a man who had started to listen to the rhythm of a place and found it slower than war, softer than loss. He would ride out at dawn and return by dusk, always with something mended fence. Posts upright, stray calves guided home, even a broken saddle stitched with care. She watched from the window, sometimes with her hands still in dishwater, sometimes holding that wooden bird like a prayer between breaths. One evening, a storm rolled in low and heavy. The wind pushed dirt through the cracks in the walls, and the thunder sounded too much, like something from another life. She stood by the back door, eyes closed, remembering a time when storms were stories told by her mother in the dark, not echoes of things broken. A knock came, soft but firm. She opened the door slowly, and there he stood, rein clinging to his coat, a coil of rope slung over his shoulder, a single glance that asked nothing but offered shelter in return. He stepped inside without a word, took off his coat, hung it carefully. She lit a lantern, the room filled with gold and shadow. Neither of them moved for a long while, just stood in that hush between strangers and something else. The other women were gone for the night, called to help a birth across town. She had stayed behind by choice, something in her too tired for cries and blood, and the reminder of what she could not give. He sat by the stove, hands outstretched to the heat. She poured tea, her fingers brushing the edge of his cup. He did not flinch, but he looked at her not like men looked when they wanted, but like someone searching for what had been lost. They didn't speak until the fire settled low. "Your eyes," he said, voice low, "they carry too much night." She looked away, not in shame, in recognition. "I was meant to hold more than silence," she whispered. He nodded. "And yet, you carry it well." She blinked hard, set the cup down, and, for the first time, let the quiet between them settle not like weight, but like warmth. In the mornings that followed, he brought her wild plums, left them by the window where the sun caught their skin. She began placing water by the church door. Before he arrived, always just enough to say, "I see you." They worked sometimes side by side, fixing shutters, stacking firewood. He showed her how to sand a board smooth without splinters. She showed him how to mend a tear in fabric, so fine it seemed untouched. One evening, she sang just a few notes, barely more than breath, while sweeping. He paused outside the door, closed his eyes, and let the song carry him to a place he had not let himself remember. She never sang again, but he never forgot the sound. Children stopped fearing him. One girl gave him a flower, and he tied it into his braid without speaking. Another boy asked if he was a chief. He smiled once, just once, and said, "No, just a man." That night, she found a second bird on her step, smaller, carved from darker wood. It faced the other. When she placed them side by side, something inside her eased, not healed, but less alone, and for the first time in years, she looked at her own reflection in the wash basin and did not turn away. The man who sold her returned in early spring. She saw him first across the street from the Mercantile, leaner, meaner, with whiskey for breath and regret for eyes. He didn't recognize her at first. Her hair was different now, braided low, her dress modest, her posture upright, in a way it had never been when she lived under his name. But when their eyes met, and she didn't flinch, he remembered, he spit on the ground, smirked. "Look what silence bought," he muttered. A woman made of stone. That night, she didn't eat. She sat by the fire, the two carved birds in her lap, her thumb tracing the curve of their wings. The Lakota man sat across from her, sharpening a blade that didn't need sharpening. His eyes never left her hands. "He's here," she said at last. He nodded once. He had already seen. The next day, whispers spread like wind across dry wheat. The man had come not just for trouble, but for claim. Claimed he still had right to her. Said the coin he took was only a loan. Claimed he'd found a preacher who'd swear the papers were still binding. She stood before the boarding house door, shaking not from fear but fury. The woman who once scrubbed floors and faded into walls now looked the sheriff in the eye and said, "He traded me for coin and drink. I am not his to claim." The sheriff looked away, said it was complicated, said there'd be a hearing. But in his eyes was the truth. Law bent easy in towns like these, where men drank with the judge and women weren't meant to speak too loud. The Lakota man said nothing that night, but he stayed outside her door until dawn, sitting cross-legged, eyes never closing. When the man returned with two others, men with fists for language and coins for hearts, she was alone in the kitchen, grinding herbs. "You think you're too good now?" The man spat. "You think a redskin makes you pure again?" She didn't answer, just stepped back, hand reaching for the knife near the stove. Before she touched it, the door burst open, and the Lakota warrior stepped in. He didn't shout, didn't curse. He moved like a storm that had already chosen its path. One blow sent the first man sprawling. The second pulled a pistol, but the warrior was faster, disarming him before breath left his lungs. Then silence. Him and the man who sold her, they stared long. "You broke something that wasn't yours," the warrior said, low and steady. The man laughed, nervous, shaking. "She's barren. Just empty bones in a pretty dress." The warrior took a step forward. "Even the earth needs rest before it can bloom again." His hand didn't shake, but he didn't strike. Instead, he turned to her, offered her the choice, and in that moment, she stepped forward, slapped the man hard across the face. Not out of vengeance, but finality. A seal to a chapter closed. The sheriff arrived minutes later. Too late, as always. The men were gone, scattered like dry leaves in wind. The boarding house never spoke of it, but no one questioned when the Lakota man built a small home behind the chapel, or when she moved her few things there. No wedding, no papers, but every morning she left water by the door, and every evening he carved birds. She woke to the sound of wood splitting. It wasn't violent, just the steady rhythm of an axe meeting oak. She stepped outside barefoot, morning mist curling around her ankles like smoke. He stood a few paces from the porch, bare arms shining with sweat, his breath rising in clouds that vanished too soon. She watched him work, the strength of him not in his size, but in the stillness he carried. Each strike was measured, not just force but memory, control, peace hard won. And as the sun crept higher, she saw it more clearly than ever. He was no longer running, neither was she. Later that day, a child came, thin, dust-covered, with a limp in his left foot and eyes wide with fear. He had walked from the canyon alone, clinging to a scrap of cloth tied to his belt military issue. His mother was gone. The soldiers had passed through weeks ago. The boy hadn't spoken since. The townspeople murmured. The preacher offered bread. No one knew what to do. She found him behind the chapel, crouched under the lilac bush. Clutching his knees, she knelt beside him without speaking, just sat. After some time, he leaned his head against her shoulder. Only then did she let the tears fall quiet, grateful. He didn't cry, but he stayed. The Lakota man approached slowly, crouched beside them. He looked into the boy's eyes, then removed the red thread from his braid and tied it gently around the boy's wrist. Family isn't who makes you, he said. It's who stands when others walk away. From that day, the boy followed him like a shadow, watched how he rode, how he braided, how he sat still by firelight. And when night fell, he curled on a cot beside theirs. The carved birds lined in a row above his bed. Weeks passed. Then came the Sunday when the town gathered for a naming. They stood at the edge of the circle, her, the warrior, and the boy under the open sky. The preacher spoke verses, unsure of their meaning. But the townsfolk watched in silence. When it came time, the boy looked to them. She knelt and took his hands. We don't ask what you were, she said. Only who you want to become. He looked at the Lakota man, then back at her, and in a voice not louder than breath, he said, "Can I be your son?" The warrior closed his eyes. Just once. A long, slow breath. Then he opened them, stepped forward, and knelt. He placed one hand on the boy's shoulder. "You already are." The people didn't cheer, but something shifted in the air, like the land itself had exhaled. That night, around the fire, the boy laid his head on the warrior's knee. She sat beside them, shawl wrapped around her shoulders, eyes closed. The warrior looked down at them, both. In a voice that broke just slightly, he said, "My heart never had a home. Now it has two." The house behind the chapel grew slowly, not in size but in weight, in meaning. New walls, a porch that creaked under evening steps, smoke from the chimney that curled like a song into the sky, each board nailed with intention, each stone in the path placed by a hand that once knew only leaving. She planted lavender along the edge, said it kept the insects and memories at bay. He built a bench under the cottonwood, said some days needed nothing more than watching clouds drift and hearing a child's laugh rise like birdsong. The boy, now sturdier, with sun-browned cheeks, and a scar that no longer stung, ran between them, like water finds the gaps in stone. He didn't ask about the past, but he kept the red thread on his wrist, frayed but firm. Evenings were quiet. He would carve. She would mend. The boy would sit on the floor, humming to himself as he lined the birds in a row. More now, one for each month passed, all facing west. One night, as the wind carried a chill, she stood at the door and watched the prairie stretch into dusk. He came beside her, the boy asleep behind them, fingers still clutching a toy horse. "It's quiet," she said. He nodded. "The kind that stays." She looked up at him. "Do you miss what came before?" He didn't answer right away. Then, "I miss what should have been, but I don't trade it for what is." She asked, barely a whisper. He touched her hand, held it gently. "You're not broken. You're waiting for what?" He looked at her with a softness that made the wind stop. "For nothing anymore. The moon rose slow and full that night. The kind of moon that remembers everything and forgives almost all. In its light, their shadows touched first. Since that evening, the house never echoed with silence again. Autumn came soft that year. The leaves turned not in bursts, but in slow surrender gold, folding into rust into earth. The boy chased them as they fell, laughing, arms outstretched like he meant to catch the season itself. She watched from the porch, a shawl over her shoulders, the steam of tea warming her face. Her hair had silver now, not much, but enough too. Mark the days that passed gently, not like storms, but like tides. The Lakota man carved less. Not because he was done, but because he had made enough. They did not speak often of what came before. Only when the wind carried scents that stirred memory, or when a silence settled too deeply in the room. Then they would sit by the fire, the boy between them, and share pieces quiet, careful pieces like embers still holding warmth. One day, she found the boy planting something behind the house. What will it be? She asked. Don't know, he said. Whatever the ground allows. She smiled, knelt beside him, helped turn the soil. Later that evening, as the sky bled into soft pink and the birds began to return to the trees, she found him, her quiet warrior by the cottonwood, a new braid falling down his back. The boy had done it, clumsy fingers, weaving with too much string, but the man wore it like armor. You let him? She asked, grinning. He touched the braid gently. He wanted to learn, and you? I wanted to be someone worth learning from. She stepped close, rested her hand on his chest. You always were. That night, the three of them sat on the porch, wrapped in one blanket. No one spoke. The moon was low, the stars flickering like breath. From the trees, an owl called once then. Again. The boy yawned, curled between them, and asked sleepily, Did we find home? Neither answered right away. Then she whispered, so only the wind could hear. No, we made it. The Lakota man placed his hand over hers, and in the stillness of that final light, it was clear. Some homes are not built from wood, but from hearts that choose to stay.